Now let's move back to Massachusetts and look at King's Phillips War, which is almost exactly contemporaneous with Bacon's Rebellion and is caused by, again, almost exactly the same thing, that more and more white settlers are moving into frontier territories where they are upsetting the balance and moving into Native American territories and causing all sorts of conflict and complications. One of the major problems was that the English did not fence their cows in Massachusetts, and the cows would wander off and then go eat all the Indians' corn. Okay, so clearly, as they moved more closer and closer to Native American territory, what we see happening is that the relations are not peaceable, and the white settlers are causing many problems for the Native Americans. So this is the base cause of King Philip's War, but there's more to it as well. Okay. Whereas the Virginia Bacon's Rebellion doesn't have that much of a cultural element. In Massachusetts, there is a leader of the Narragansett Native Americans. I'm sorry, Wampanoag, not Narragansett, Wampanoag. And his name was Metacom, known to the English as King Philip. This is an image of King Philip produced about 200 years after the conflict. And the causes for King Philip's War are, yes, English colonists' lust for land, cattle in particular were destroying Native American cornfields, but also Christianization. All right. The English did make some attempt to Christianize the Native Americans. Now, nothing compared to what the Spanish were doing. Nothing compared to what the Spanish were doing. But the Puritans established a few praying towns, especially under the leadership of John Mayhew. And John Sassamon, who is a Harvard educated Christian Indian who is friendly to the Puritans, suddenly ends up murdered. All right. And it turns out that Metacom, or King Philip, had him murdered because he didn't like to see how many Wampanoag Indians were converting to Christianity. Approximately 1,600 Native Americans of Wampanoag and Narragansett tribal membership had entered these praying towns and had sought accommodations with the newcomers and had adopted Christianity. So there's both a cultural cause, this feeling that Native Americans were losing their traditional religion and customs and cultures and language as the English were moving into their territory and trying to Christianize them. And there's also a sort of economic cause, which was that Native Americans and white settlers were increasingly coming into conflict over land. It is a terrible war that is fought between the Native Americans and the English. The war killed 1,000 colonists and 3,000 Native Americans, which was nearly a third of the population of southern New England. 1 in 10 white New Englanders were killed and their settlements were pushed back to the coast, but it was even more devastating for the Native Americans. What ultimately happens is the Native Americans were defeated, although it was anyone's guess how this war would end when it first broke out. It was largely the assistance that the white settlers got from the Mohawk when Metacom failed to get the Mohawk from upstate New York to join his side against the English. But thus far, and in fact, it was the most bloody war in American history per capita, right? And it was really devastating for the Native Americans. Native Americans of Wampanoag or Narragansett descent who had sided up with King Philip, hundreds of them were sold into slavery, including King Philip, or rather Metacom's son, because of course they wanted to get his son as far away as possible. And what this does is it breaks the alliance between the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. King Philip's War shifts power away from Native Americans and towards the white settlers, and ultimately, this is a conflict which results in the expulsion of Native Americans from New England. Now there are still Native Americans in New England after this, but their power had largely been broken. All right. Now there's a couple more revolts we can talk about. In the Yama C Revolt, again, this is about English settlers encroaching upon Native American territory. Basically, what had happened is that Barbados, which was an English settlement, a lot of indentured servants who had earned their freedom in Barbados, they moved to what is today South Carolina. They didn't know how to grow anything there. So what they started to do was actually to enslave nearby Native Americans and sell them into slavery. A lot of the enslaved workers in the Caribbean in the 1600s were actually Native American. They were not just Black. The transition to primarily enslaved African labor does take a while. At the beginning, you can see on these plantations, there's white indentured servants working alongside Native Americans who were enslaved, alongside enslaved people of African descent. We'll see that by 1700, in most places, the transition to a Black labor force is complete. But in South Carolina, when it settled in 1670, many of the people who settle it realize that they can make a lot of money by kidnapping Native Americans and selling them into slavery in Barbados. And this makes a lot of money for the settlers of South Carolina for a while, until Native Americans wise up, realize that in fact, if they continue to allow these South Carolinians to exist there, they too will be enslaved. And what happens is that the Yamasee War occurs, which is when basically all of the Native Americans, except for the Cherokee in this territory, join together, gang up against the white settlers and nearly push them back into the ocean. And, what we see here is that, the earliest enterprise of these South Carolina settlers had very much disrupted the Native American populations. And the South Carolinians very quickly realized that, this is going to be a problem for them. And they switch away from enslaved Native American labor to, African labor. And of course, South Carolina is going to become the epicenter of slavery in the American South. And in fact, very quickly after the Yamasee War occurs from 1715 to 1717, we can see that a large number of people of African descent begin to be imported into South Carolina, largely to grow rice. And not only do the white settlers turn away from Native American enslaved people for their labor needs, the Black population in Virginia actually begins to outstrip the white population. All right, last one to talk about then I'll put this up and let you go, is to talk about New Mexico. Okay, so far, by talking about Virginia, Massachusetts, and South Carolina, we've only talked about English settlements. English settlements are different than Spanish settlements. Okay, English settlements were largely intended to become farms and agricultural territory. Most of the people who left England intended to move to America with the intention of getting land for themselves. Even indentured servants hoped that they would get land for themselves once they were emancipated, when they saw that their opportunities were diminished. That caused Bacon's Revolt. Okay. The Spanish colonies were different. And, hopefully you've watched my video on Spanish America, but in fact, the Spanish colonies, the effort to colonize this territory was not really by people who moved in and set up farms. The British were an empire of settlement. They wanted land and farms, right? But that's not really what the Spanish were doing. First of all, the Spanish had an incredibly large amount of territory to try and control, with an incredibly small number of Spaniards, reaching all the way from New Mexico down to the Tierra del Fuego in Chile. And the hinterlands, or the borderlands of Spanish settlement, borderlands being another term for frontier, these areas where a lot of cultures kind of coexist with one another and no one culture has more power than anybody else. One of these territories that the Spanish tried to exert their control over was the Rio Grande Valley in what is today New Mexico. Now, the Spanish could never really send any. First of all, Spain was not a particularly populous country in 1600, and they could never afford to send enough settlers over to the New World to claim this territory through cultivating the land. Nor did they really have the desire to, because one of the Spanish, they were after God, glory, and gold, right? And God, as cynical as we might be, the idea was to spread Christianity to Native Americans. Now, why were they interested in turning Native Americans into Christian? There's a number of reasons. First of all, of course, the church had directed them to do so. The Catholic Church wanted them to find as many souls to convert to Catholicism as possible, especially because this is pretty soon after the Reformation, and the Catholic Church is losing a lot of people who are going to join the Protestant churches. So Catholicism is losing a lot of its membership. As a result, there is a real concerted effort to convert Native Americans to Christians. All right. And this was the whole intention of the missions. You can see the missions here, and there were many, 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 many of them throughout the Spanish territories, especially Spanish territories where there were not very many Spaniards to settle. What they would do is they'd send up a few soldiers, but they would also send priests. All right. And the priests would establish churches. The idea was that Native Americans would come live on the church grounds, work the land, and become Christian. And a lot of them did. Sometimes they did it to escape the Apaches, who had just adapted horses and were particularly violent against their neighbors, I suppose. And, they saw the mission grounds as protection. Some of them would move into the mission and get fed for a while and work for a while, and then kind of drift out of the missions once they were able to support themselves again, or once summer returned. But largely the idea here was to convert Native Americans to Christianity. See, the English Empire was an empire of exclusion. All right. There was not really much of an effort to intermix with Native Americans. And even John Mayhew's attempts to settle praying towns in New England to try and convert Native Americans to Christianity, these efforts were small, few, and far between. But the entire Spanish effort was to try and convert Native Americans to Christianity, to teach them to speak Spanish, basically to Hispanicize them, with the idea that Native Americans would serve as sort of proxy rulers or settlers over the land, carrying out the wishes and ambitions of the Spanish. And of course, in order to Hispanicize Native Americans, this is a cultural imperialism intended to strip them of their native languages, native lands, not lands so much, native languages, but certainly their native customs, right? And what happens is that the Pueblo, who had a very sophisticated religious system involving kachinas and gods, what happens is that the Pueblo start to feel that, and for good reason, that the Spanish aren't doing enough for them. The Apaches still attack them. There's a drought. There were, in fact, Native Americans being enslaved and sent to the silver mines in Chihuahua from these supposedly protected Pueblo missions. So what happens is that under the leadership of a Native American named Pope, the Pueblo Revolt. And look at the date, 1680. I mean, again, this is almost exactly the same time as we have Bacon's Rebellion and King Phillips War occurring. Basically, what's happening here is, about 200 years after Columbus, Native Americans have had enough sustained contact with white settlers that conflicts are inevitably occurring. What Pope and his Pueblo rebels are able to accomplish, however, is to force the Spanish out of New Mexico. And the Spanish are actually forced out militarily. The priests are killed or defrocked, the churches are desecrated, and the Native Americans, under the leadership of Pope, are able to push the Spanish out for about 12 years. They have to retreat to El Paso, and then they come back afterwards. But they are going to treat the Native Americans differently from this period forward. Okay, so basically what I've tried to show here today then is that, you have these revolts in the in America, and if you look at the timing of them, you can see that these smaller conflagrations, the Opochancanoughs uprising and the Pequot massacre, happen as soon as the settlers start to spread into territory which is dominated by Native Americans. But about 50 years later, we have these much more significant wars really occur between in New England, between the Wampanoag Indians and the New England settlers from England in Virginia between these poor ex-indentured servants who are living on the frontier and are inevitably getting into conflicts with their Native American neighbors. And then in New Mexico, an almost purely cultural revolt as the Pueblo hoped to remove the Spanish and to return to their cultural customs of worshiping the gods as they pleased. So what we see here then is conflict, which inevitably resulted as one, prior to these major conflicts, colonists and Native Americans could coexist, if not peaceably, at least without major conflict. But as more settlers arrive, the sort of issues that lay at the heart of the contradictions between Native American culture and the settler culture start to arise and result in major conflicts. All right. Well, that's a lot there.